Elliot Grayson had spent years chasing stories that most reporters would never touch. He had exposed corruption in political offices, uncovered scandals within corporate empires, and followed trails of deception that had led him into dangerous territory more times than he cared to count. But none of those stories had ever felt quite like this. Angelina Jolie's secret island. The very idea of it sounded like a conspiracy theory, something whispered about in private circles but never actually proven. The first time he heard about it, he dismissed it as meaningless celebrity gossip. A Hollywood actress disappearing for months at a time didn't necessarily mean anything. But then he started noticing patterns, long, unaccounted gaps in Jolie's public appearances, stretches of time where she simply ceased to exist in the public eye. And unlike other celebrities, she left behind no trace. No leaked photos, no accidental sightings, no sources from inside her team feeding tidbits to the press. It was as if she had mastered the art of vanishing. Elliot had followed missing persons cases before, and he knew that no one disappears without help. Someone had to be flying her to this island. Someone had to be managing the logistics of her stays. Someone knew where she went when the world wasn't looking. He started small, digging through flight records, hoping to find private charters that might match the time frame of her disappearances. It took weeks of searching, but eventually, he found the first crack in the wall. A private jet, owned by a shell company based out of the Cayman Islands, had been making frequent unlisted flights out of Los Angeles for years. Flights that aligned perfectly with the periods of time when Jolie was missing from the public. Elliot's gut told him that this wasn't just coincidence. This jet wasn't taking her to typical vacation spots. If it was, there would have been at least one leaked photo. Paparazzi had managed to track down reclusive billionaires on their yachts, secretive heads of state on private retreats. There was no reason why one of the most famous women in the world should be able to disappear completely. And yet, she had. Elliot took his findings to a contact in aviation, someone who had helped him with stories in the past. The man reviewed the logs carefully, his expression growing more serious as he flipped through the pages. He had seen unusual flight patterns before, executives hiding affairs, politicians sneaking off to private locations. But this was something different. The plane wasn't just flying to a remote location. It was landing somewhere that wasn't supposed to exist. According to official records, the aircraft was making stops in the Pacific, near an uncharted island that wasn't registered in any commercial or private databases. The coordinates showed nothing but open ocean, yet the plane continued to land there repeatedly, year after year. Elliot's pulse quickened. If this island wasn't on the maps, it meant someone wanted it to stay hidden. And if Jolie was disappearing there, it meant she wasn't just escaping for relaxation. She was hiding something. The next step was to find someone who had been on those flights. Private pilots, security personnel, someone had to know where that plane was going. But getting people to talk about Jolie's disappearances was proving harder than he expected. Most sources shut him down immediately. Some feigned ignorance. Others simply refused to engage. It wasn't just reluctance, it was fear. Then after weeks of searching, he found Michael Hayes, a former private pilot who had spent years flying Hollywood's elite. Hayes had left the industry abruptly, retreating into near seclusion in a quiet coastal town. His name had surfaced on flight logs for the same jet that had been making the secret trips. If anyone could confirm where Jolie had been going, it was him. Elliot made the trip out to find him, driving through narrow, winding roads until he reached a house that looked forgotten by time. The windows were shut, the paint was peeling, and there was no sign of life. But the moment Elliot knocked on the door, he knew someone was inside. The door didn't open right away. Silence stretched on, long enough that Elliot almost considered leaving. But then the sound of footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. When the door finally creaked open, Michael Hayes stood there, eyes filled with something between exhaustion and caution. Elliot introduced himself, mentioning that he was investigating Jolie's secret travels. At the mention of her name, Hayes's expression darkened. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, without a word, he stepped aside, motioning for Elliot to enter. Elliot didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, knowing that whatever Hayes was about to tell him would change everything. Elliot Grayson stepped cautiously into the dimly lit house, his senses on high alert. The air inside smelled of dust and old paper, as if the place had been untouched for years. Michael Hayes, the former private pilot, closed the door behind him with a slow, deliberate motion, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing through the silence. Elliot studied the man in front of him. Hayes looked worn down, like someone who had spent years trying to forget something he couldn't escape. His face was lined with exhaustion, his movements careful, almost calculated. The way he lingered near the door suggested a man who had been waiting for this moment, though whether he had been dreading it or expecting it, Elliot couldn't tell. Hayes moved toward the kitchen without a word, leaving Elliot to follow. The house felt abandoned in many ways: bare walls, sparse furniture, stacks of old newspapers piled in the corners. It wasn't the home of a man living a peaceful retirement. It was the home of someone who hadn't wanted to be found. Elliot waited, as Hayes pulled out a bottle of whiskey from a cabinet, pouring himself a glass with slow, steady hands. The man took a sip, exhaled deeply, then turned his sharp, tired eyes toward Elliot. The moment stretched between them like an unspoken warning. Elliot didn't need to be told that Hayes knew exactly why he was here. The silence was heavy, pressing, but Elliot had spent years navigating these moments, the moments before the truth finally surfaced. He pulled out a small notepad from his jacket, flipping it open to the flight records he had uncovered. He placed it on the table between them, tapping lightly on the dates that aligned with Jolie's disappearances. Hayes's gaze flickered to the pages, then back to Elliot. His grip on the glass tightened. He didn't deny it. Elliot watched as the man ran a hand through his graying hair, then leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. He confirmed that he had been one of the pilots assigned to a very specific set of flights. These flights had no official records beyond the private logs kept by the company, and those logs had since been wiped from any accessible databases. Elliot's pulse quickened. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase these trips. Hayes explained that the flights always followed the same pattern: late-night departures from private airstrips, minimal staff on board, direct routes to an island that didn't officially exist. There were no customs, no border control, no records of arrival or departure. The only people who ever set foot on that plane were Jolie, a handful of unidentified individuals, and her most trusted security personnel. Elliot leaned in, his mind racing. If these flights had been happening for years, then this wasn't just a private retreat. This was something far bigger. He pressed for more details, asking about the island itself, its location, what he had seen during his time there. Hayes hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly against the rim of his glass. He admitted that he had never actually set foot on the island. Pilots weren't allowed to land or disembark. The aircraft would approach the coordinates, hovering just above sea level, where private boats would meet them under cover of night. Elliot's skin prickled. There were no airports, no runways, no visible infrastructure, just an island that existed only to those who knew it was there. Hayes revealed that the passengers never spoke much during the flights. Jolie always remained silent, her focus distant, her demeanor different from how the world saw her. She wasn't the glowing humanitarian, the movie star with a warm smile. She was something else entirely: serious, calculated, detached. Elliot pressed further. Who were the other people that traveled with her? Hayes took another slow sip of whiskey before answering. He admitted that he never knew their names. They weren't Hollywood executives or friends from the industry. They were men in dark suits, men who never spoke unless spoken to, men who carried themselves like ghosts. And then there were the shipments. Elliot felt a chill spread down his spine as Hayes described cargo being loaded onto the plane before departure. Sealed containers, large enough to carry something significant, but never labeled. Every time they landed near the island, those containers were transferred onto the waiting boats, disappearing into the night. No one ever questioned it. No one ever spoke about it. Elliot knew then that this island wasn't just a secret getaway. It was something far more dangerous. Hayes leaned back in his chair, staring at the glass in his hand. He had been sitting on this truth for years. Elliot could see it, the weight of carrying something too heavy to say aloud. Finally, after a long silence, Hayes uttered a final warning. He told Elliot that people had disappeared for asking too many questions about this island. Michael wasn't the only pilot who had worked those flights, but he was the only one left who hadn't vanished. Elliot felt his heartbeat quicken. He had come looking for answers, but now he understood why no one had ever published this story before. There were forces protecting this secret, forces that had already erased others who had come too close. Elliot stood, his mind buzzing, his hand steady despite the storm brewing inside him. He knew what came next. He had to find the island, and if he did, there was a chance he might never come back. Elliot Grayson sat in his dimly lit motel room, the weight of Michael Hayes' words still pressing on his chest. People had disappeared for asking too many questions. He knew what that meant. He had been a journalist long enough to understand that there were stories that came with consequences, stories that had the power to erase people completely. But he had already come too far. He had spent the last 24 hours cross-referencing everything Hayes had told him. Angelina Jolie had an island. That much was clear now. But it wasn't just any private retreat. It was a location that had been deliberately wiped from maps, a place that had no records, no commercial flights, no satellite documentation. And yet, she had been going there for years. Elliot ran a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping in. How did someone like Jolie, one of the most recognizable women in the world, manage to disappear for months at a time? The answer was simple. She had help. He had to get there. But commercial means were out of the question. The island wasn't listed, and there were no flights that could take him anywhere near it. That left one option: the supply boats. Hayes had mentioned that shipments were routinely transported to and from the island, unmarked containers vanishing into the night. Elliot knew that if he was going to see this place for himself, he needed to be on one of those boats. By the time he arrived at the nearest port town, the sun had already started to set. The docks were quiet, save for the occasional worker hauling cargo, moving crates from the warehouses to the boats. Elliot kept his head down, observing from a distance, waiting for the right opportunity. It wasn't long before he spotted them, two large unmarked vessels docked at the far end of the pier. They weren't ordinary fishing boats or commercial transport ships. They were too sleek, too private, the kind used by people who didn't want to be found. Elliot moved carefully, staying within the shadows. He watched as a series of crates were rolled onto the deck, identical to the ones Hayes had described. They were heavy, sealed shut, with no markings or identification. Whatever was inside them was never meant to be inspected. That was his way in. He made his move, slipping between the workers, blending in just enough to avoid suspicion. He kept his head down as he maneuvered toward the loading area, waiting for the right moment. When no one was looking, he climbed into the back of one of the storage containers, pulling the door shut just as the final shipment was being secured. The weight was unbearable. For nearly an hour he remained still, his breath shallow, the dim space around him pressing in. Then came the sound of the ship's engines roaring to life, the sensation of movement as they drifted away from the dock. He was on his way. The journey lasted hours. It was impossible to tell how far they had gone. But the air inside the container grew colder, the humidity thicker. The rocking of the waves suggested they had left any recognizable routes long ago. Then finally, the ship stopped. The doors creaked open, flooding the space with moonlight. Elliot barely had time to react before the crates were being unloaded. He stayed low, moving quickly, slipping out onto the deck while the workers were preoccupied. And that's when he saw it. The island. It was unlike anything he had expected. Dense, untouched jungle stretched beyond the dock, shrouded in mist. The kind of place that had existed long before men had ever set foot on it. There were no resorts, no signs of a luxurious escape, just an eerie silence that blanketed the air. But what stood out most were the structures hidden within the trees. Elliot's pulse quickened. This wasn't just some isolated retreat. There were buildings here, facilities, secure compounds. guarded by men who looked nothing like vacation staff. And then, in the distance, he saw her, Angelina Jolie. She was walking along a pathway, her expression unreadable, her movements deliberate. She wasn't dressed for a getaway. There was no sign of casual luxury, no beach attire. She wore dark clothing, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed ahead. Elliot stayed low, watching as she disappeared into one of the buildings. What the hell was this place? Nothing about it made sense. This wasn't an escape, it was an operation. He could feel it in his gut now. Jolie wasn't hiding here, she was running something. Elliot knew he had mere minutes before someone noticed the extra presence on the island. He had to move fast. He needed proof, something concrete, something undeniable. He pulled out his camera, snapping photos as quickly as he could. The guards, the structures, the shipments, and then the lights above him shifted. A floodlight, someone had seen him. The next thing he heard was the sound of men shouting, and then the gunshot. Elliot ran. Elliot Grayson ran. His feet pounded against the damp ground, his breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts as he darted between trees, the jungle pressing in on all sides. The gunshot had been a warning. They weren't aiming to kill him yet. But that wouldn't last. Long, he had been seen. He had made it too far, too deep into Angelina Jolie's secret island, and now the people who protected it were closing in. The terrain was uneven, roots twisting up from the earth like traps designed to slow him down. He stumbled, caught himself just before falling, then pushed forward. Behind him, voices shouted orders, boots crunching against the undergrowth. They were hunting him. The camera was still clutched in his grip, the strap tangled around his wrist. The pictures were all that mattered now. Images of the island, of the security, of the crates being unloaded in the dead of night, and of Angelina Jolie herself, walking through the compound like she belonged there. If he could make it off this island, if he could get those photos into the world, the truth would finally be exposed. He had to keep moving. He spotted a clearing ahead, the faint glow of artificial lights flickering through the trees. He slowed, lowering himself to the ground, creeping forward. Peering through the thick foliage, he saw a communications outpost, one of the few structures on the island that looked remotely modern. Satellite dishes stretched toward the sky, wires snaking into a reinforced metal building. If there was any way to contact the outside world, this was it. Elliot scanned the area. 2 guards patrolled outside, armed but not particularly alert. They weren't expecting anyone to be out here. This island had been a fortress for years, protected by secrecy alone. No one had ever dared infiltrate it, until now. Elliot tightened his grip on the camera. He needed to act fast. He crouched lower, moving through the shadows, keeping his footsteps light. The sound of waves crashing in the distance told him he was close to the other side of the island, closer to escape. But then, before he could take another step, a cold voice cut through the night. "Don't move." Elliot's entire body went rigid. The voice was female, steady, unafraid. It was Angelina Jolie. Slowly, he turned. She stood behind him a few feet away, illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the trees. She didn't look surprised to see him. Her expression was calm, almost expectant, as if she had known he would make it this far. She wasn't dressed like the Hollywood icon the world knew. There was no designer clothing, no effortless elegance. She wore all black, practical, her stance firm, her eyes colder than he had ever seen in any interview, any red carpet appearance. This wasn't an actress. This was someone else entirely. Elliot tightened his grip on the camera, but before he could move, 2 of the guards stepped into view, their weapons raised but not fired. They were waiting for her command. For a long moment there was silence. Then Jolie stepped closer. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Not a threat. A statement. Elliot forced himself to breathe. He had spent years exposing people who didn't want to be exposed, but he had never encountered someone like this. He had expected panic, anger, denial, but she wasn't afraid. She knew he had found the island. She knew he had seen too much, and she was still in control. Elliot squared his shoulders, refusing to back down. This was bigger than just a hidden island. This was bigger than secrecy. This was power. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice low. Jolie tilted her head slightly, considering him. "A sanctuary," she said finally. Her voice was calm, controlled, practiced. Elliot's grip on the camera tightened. A sanctuary for what? He had seen the crates, the security, the figures that moved in and out of the compound with the kind of efficiency that didn't belong to a vacation retreat. This was an operation. "You disappear for months at a time," Elliot said. "No one knows where you go, no one questions it. But this isn't just about privacy, is it? You're running something here, something no one is supposed to see." Jolie didn't flinch. She simply observed him, like she was deciding something. Then she gestured slightly and the guards lowered their weapons. Elliot's heart pounded, confusion creeping in. If she wanted to get rid of him, this would have been the moment. Instead, she did something unexpected. She took a step closer. "Do you really want to know the truth?" she asked. Elliot hesitated. Yes, that was the reason he had come. That was why he had risked everything. But something in her expression made him realize that the truth wouldn't be what he expected. For the first time since setting foot on the island, he wasn't sure if he wanted to hear it. Jolie studied him for a moment longer, then nodded, as if she understood something he didn't. "Leave," she said. "Final. Absolute. A command. Not a request." Elliot's pulse hammered in his chest. She was letting him go. But why? His instinct screamed at him. This wasn't mercy. This wasn't fear. This was control. Whatever was happening on this island, she wasn't afraid of it being discovered, because she knew no one would believe him. Elliot looked at the camera in his hands, at the photos he had taken, the proof he had risked his life for. But standing here facing her, he realized something chilling. She wasn't hiding from the world. The world was hiding from her, and she had just let him live because she knew the truth would never leave this island. Elliot felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. He turned slowly, stepping backward, then finally forced his feet to move. He walked away, his heartbeat echoing in his ears, his mind screaming that he had just come face to face with something far bigger than he had ever imagined. Angelina Jolie stood motionless as he disappeared into the night. She had won.